In 1776, this country had 2.5 million people, no real army, and a debt it couldn't pay. Before the last person born that year died of old age, it owned half a continent and had beaten the world's most powerful empire twice. That's not folklore, that's 70 years, start to finish. And right in the middle of it sits a war most Americans have never even heard of. A war historians themselves call the Forgotten War. By the end of this video, you'll understand why it's forgotten and why it might be the most important 70 years in modern history. Let's rewind to the start because none of this was supposed to happen. 13 colonies, no standing army, no navy to speak of, a government that couldn't reliably pay its own soldiers, let alone fund a war. And on the other side of the Atlantic, Britain, the most powerful empire on Earth, the largest navy in the world, professional soldiers, deep credit, and a track record of crushing rebellions exactly like this one. By any reasonable measure, the American Revolution should have ended in 1776 or 1777 at the latest. George Washington lost more battles than he won in those early years. New York was a disaster. His army was pushed out of Manhattan and chased across New Jersey, worn down by winter and desertion to a fraction of its original size. At Valley Forge, men without shoes left bloody footprints in the snow. The turning point came on Christmas night, 1776, when Washington crossed the icy Delaware River for a desperate surprise attack on Trenton. Not because he was winning, but because if he didn't do something, the entire war effort might have simply dissolved by New Year's. This was never a story of inevitable victory. On paper, the Americans had almost no right to win, and yet somehow they won. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 gave the United States its independence and immediately created a new problem. Could this fragile confederation of states actually govern itself? So in 1787, the founders tried again, drafting the Constitution that, with amendments, still runs the country today. Then came the moment that changed what America even was. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France, 828,000 square miles, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, for $15 million. Do the math, and that comes out to roughly 3 cents an acre. It's arguably the single greatest real estate deal in human history, and overnight, it doubled the size of the country. But size isn't the same as respect. In 1812, the United States went to war with Britain again, and this time the fighting reached the capital itself. In August of 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C., and burned the White House to the ground. It remains one of the most humbling moments in American history, proof that independence in name didn't mean safety in practice. The war technically ended in a stalemate, but one battle fought after the peace treaty was already signed. New Orleans, 1815, turned General Andrew Jackson into a national hero and convinced plenty of Americans they'd just won a second war of independence outright. Technicalities aside, it took less than a decade to answer that humiliation. In 1823, President James Monroe issued a doctrine that would have sounded absurd coming from almost anyone else. The Americas, he declared, were now closed to further European colonization. A 47-year-old country without a navy capable of enforcing that promise was telling the empires of Europe where they could and couldn't go. That's the exact moment world power stops being a boast and starts being a claim the country is willing to make out loud. Here's the part of the story most people never learn. By the 1840s, the United States had a new obsession: manifest destiny. The belief that the country wasn't just allowed to stretch from coast to coast, but destined to. Texas had already broken away from Mexico and joined the Union in 1845. Mexico considered that an act of war. President James Polk considered it an opportunity. In 1846, after a disputed border skirmish, Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. It passed, but not without a fight. Critics called it bluntly Mr. Polk's War, and accused the president of manufacturing a conflict to seize territory he'd wanted all along. A freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln stood up and demanded Polk show Congress the exact spot where American blood had supposedly been shed on American soil. a challenge that became known as the Spot Resolutions, and one that made Lincoln deeply unpopular back home for questioning a war already in progress. Even the soldiers fighting it had doubts. A young lieutenant named Ulysses S. Grant served in that war, and decades later, as one of the most celebrated generals in American history, he wrote this about it. "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. And yet the war went ahead. It lasted 2 years. When it finally ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the terms were staggering. Mexico ceded roughly half its national territory to the United States, land that would become California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of several other states. In one single treaty, the United States grew by close to a third. There's one more twist worth knowing. The junior officers who fought this war side by side, Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman, Stonewall Jackson, would spend the next major war on opposite sides of the battlefield. The Mexican-American War wasn't just a land grab. It was, unintentionally, the training ground for the Civil War. This is the chapter that barely survives in classrooms. Not because it's unimportant, if anything, it's one of the most consequential wars America ever fought, but because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit the story of a plucky underdog nation. It's the story of a young power taking what it wanted and justifying it after the fact. That discomfort is exactly why it's called the Forgotten War, and exactly why you need to know it. Then, almost as if the story wanted an exclamation point, came timing nobody could have planned. In January of 1848, the same year Mexico signed away half its territory, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. Word spread within months. Within a year, tens of thousands of people were pouring into a territory the United States had owned for mere weeks. The gold rush turned a war prize into a population boom almost overnight. By 1850, the picture was almost unrecognizable from 1776. The United States now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The census that year counted roughly 23 million people, nearly 10 times the population at independence. Railroads, ports, and cities were rising on land that decades earlier hadn't even appeared on an American map. Think about what that means in human terms. Someone born free in the colonies in 1776, a subject of the British Crown at birth, could, within a single lifetime, watch their country defeat that same empire, buy a third of a continent from France, survive a second war with Britain, warn off every empire in Europe, fight and win a war against its southern neighbor, and stretch from ocean to ocean. Not over centuries, over one lifetime. That's the triumphant version of this story, the one usually told. But every mile of that expansion had a cost, and not just to Mexico. So why don't we talk about the Mexican-American War the way we talk about the Revolution or the Civil War? Maybe because it complicates the story America likes to tell about itself, it's easier to celebrate the doctrine that warned Europe away from the Americas than to sit with the war that took half of Mexico to fill in the map. But leaving a chapter out of the story doesn't make it less true. It just makes the rest of the story harder to fully understand. 70 years. That's how long it took to go from a broke, outgunned confederation of 13 colonies to a continental power of 23 million people. Some of it is a story worth being proud of. Some of it isn't. Both halves are true at the same time, and a country, like a person, is usually more honest when it can hold both. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If this is the war history chose to forget, what does that tell you about which wars get remembered? And who gets to decide? If this kind of forgotten history is exactly what you come here for, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.